Today, we are talking about misinformation and disinformation. How do you detect it? How do you talk about it? And how do you fight it? The good news is you know to be skeptical. According to the latest Edelman Annual Trust Barometer, trust in social media, where disinformation often travels, is at an all-time low. Only 27% of the public trust social media. But how do we address this growing challenge? To talk about this, I am joined by a phenomenal expert, somebody who both understands journalism, disinformation, and digital media, Claire Wardle. She is co-founder and U.S. director of First Draft. That is a nonprofit dedicated to tackling misinformation and disinformation, a former research fellow at the Shorenstein Center for Media at Harvard University's JFK School of Government. She's also run the Tao Center for Digital Journalism at Columbia University. So before we jump into some specifics, because I know you have a lot of detail on what's going on with vaccine misinformation and how journalists should interact with this, would you just set the stage for us? What is the difference between disinformation and misinformation?
I would love to. So disinformation is false information that people are deliberately creating and sharing to cause harm. That might be harm because they're trying to make money off something, they're trying to scam you, or it might be politics, trying to get political power, but they are deliberately doing this. Misinformation is also false information, but the people who are sharing it don't realize that it's false, and so they don't mean any harm. So if my mum gets fooled on Facebook and reshares something, often people do that because they're trying to be helpful. They're like, oh, have you seen this? And that's the problem, is the number of people creating disinformation is relatively small. Many of us are sharing it as misinformation, not realizing that it's false or misleading, and certainly not trying to cause any harm.
And First Draft tackles both of these issues. Would you just tell us a little bit about what First Draft is and how it works?
Yeah, so we were founded about 5 years ago. We're a nonprofit, and we basically do a lot of work with other organizations who are trying to tackle misinformation. So we train journalists, we work with health authorities, we work with community organizations, because they're trusted in the most part. And we're trying to say, here's ways that you can improve your coverage, or here's how you can talk to your communities about this. So we build training, we do research. We're throwing a lot of spaghetti at the wall because actually we don't know very much about what really works in this space. And so I'm previously a researcher from an academic background. I was like, that's too slow. Right now we need to do things and see what we can make work.
I know, it's praxis, right? Theory and practice. Let's get it going. So I want to talk first. We first met because we were both talking on a panel about vaccine hesitancy. And you anticipated an enormous amount of disinformation around vaccines early. First, I should just establish that I think it's a third of Americans say they are unlikely or hesitant to get a COVID-19 vaccine, in part because of information that they're getting about it, according to UC Davis. So give us a sense of why these narratives are so prevalent. And I'm very interested in this concept of data deficit.
Yeah, so we knew there was going to be problems around this vaccine because we've seen vaccine skepticism, vaccine hesitancy around previous vaccines. Measles, for example, there was an outbreak in New York, in Brooklyn, in the spring of 2019. So we knew this was going to happen, especially because in the last 12 months, many people have had their lives turned upside down. They've lost jobs, everything has changed. And so in that moment, all of us are kind of in this fight or flight mode, which makes us much more susceptible to misinformation. And so we knew that this kind of mix between, misinformation out there around vaccines was going to draw more people in than normal. But we also have to say there are many people right now who always get their children immunized, always get a flu shot, who with this vaccine are saying, I just want to wait a little bit. So the big question is, will this vaccine skepticism continue? Or as more people get it and we're like, oh, hang on, then maybe we'll actually see these numbers fall, hopefully.
Now, you have divided vaccine hesitancy and anti-vaccine narratives into different categories. Would you share those categories?
Yeah, so we did some research in English, French, and Spanish, and we basically looked at online posts on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter about vaccines. So we weren't specifically looking at misinformation. We wanted to see all the different ways people talked about it. And in English, the number one narrative, the way that people talk about it, is not necessarily about safety or efficacy, is it going to work, but it's actually about liberty and freedom. So there are many people who are saying, who's the government to tell me that I have to get vaccinated? It's the same as the mask and the lockdown. This is the government trying to make things mandatory. I won't be able to go to work unless I get vaccinated. So actually, a lot of the conversations in the English language are around that, people's concerns about those issues.
Can I just probe you on that? Is that in English or is that specifically in the US?
No, that's in English. So we see similar patterns in Australia and the UK and Canada. Spanish, it was a lot more about religiosity and morality. And in France, it was much more about, or French narratives, it was being concerned about the power of big pharma, and it was kind of those kind of concerns. So very interesting that it's not always the same per language, but there are many ways that vaccines are being discussed.
And is it innocent people just casually sharing this because they're passionate, or are there moneyed or determined forces pushing out some of this information deliberately?
So some of it is deliberate, but it's relatively small. I mean, for example, we're seeing RT, Russia Today, which is a state-sponsored media outlet, pushing misleading narratives around the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, which the US is taking because it's in their interest to drive down trust while they're selling to Argentina. So there's kind of this awful vaccine nationalism happening. But to answer your question, you asked me earlier, I didn't answer it, about this concept of data deficits. Yeah. So whilst misinformation is a problem, many people just have questions. They're asking, so what's mRNA? I've never heard of it before. Can somebody explain that to me? Well, if it's safe, why does Pfizer have indemnity from the UK government? That doesn't seem to make any sense. And well, I'm thinking of getting pregnant next year. Like, how much of this vaccine was tested on people who were pregnant? That's not misinformation. That's people having really good questions. The problem is that government authorities, news media haven't got clear answers to those questions. So if I go online, I get both sides. Some people saying it's safe if you're pregnant, some people saying it's not. And so I'm left not being sure. The WHO is conflicting with the CDC. So we also have to understand that when there's confusion, you know what seems really certain? A conspiracy theory. Right. That is a simple, powerful narrative that sucks me in because somebody's giving me a clear explanation. Over here, people are like, well, science is complicated and nuanced. We have to wait and see. Well, right now, people are scared and they want certainty. And unfortunately, the kind of fact-based science community, science evolves, science develops, science changes. But right now, people want certainty. And that's why there is a vulnerability and susceptibility to some of these simple conspiracy explanations.
I wonder, is the way the media talks about information sometimes contributing to all this? And what I mean is, one of the reasons I started what I'm doing and went into is because I think there's too much jargon in the news. We don't explain what we're talking about. People leave feeling less informed. They don't feel confident, and then they're panicked and anxious and they're looking for other answers. If we spent more time literally defining our terms over and over, saying what we meant, saying what these terms mean, could that contribute to inoculating people? Or
yes, yeah, but you're absolutely right. News is about the latest. So there was some great research in the 1980s actually about the BBC's coverage of the Middle East. And they spoke to these people in Britain and said, I see these attacks every night on the news, but who's occupying whose territories? I'm totally confused. And that was because every night for 4 minutes, the BBC would talk about the latest and people hadn't got the foundations. And I think about that research all the time with vaccines. If I walked down the street and said, who wants to tell me how a vaccine works? Most people wouldn't be able to tell me the fundamentals of that, not for any fault of their own, but just we've done a really bad job of explaining that. So you throw in something like mRNA, which has actually been tested for 7 to 10 years now. Right. It's not actually that new, but as news media, we focused on, is it 95% or 92% effective? It was like the horse race of the vaccine. And we failed to actually say, this is, these are how vaccines work. These are the expected side effects. Some people will die because if you vaccinate this many people, there will be some people, they will die, not connected to the vaccine. Right. But, we've seen really problematic news coverage, which we should have seen coming. We should have done more training. We should have said, doing a push alert, the New York Times, about an adverse side effects in wherever they did, Alaska. Who are you helping? You're actually just seeding more concern and confusion.
This is something the public doesn't see, but when you're inside a news organization as a journalist, you are retrained from your natural instincts to focus on the very newest detail in a thing, even if it's not the most important or the thing that will educate people because it's new. And so you reshape your story around this new detail, and we end up not providing enough information. And it sounds like maybe that's one strategy to rejigger providing information is repeat yourself sometimes, even if it sounds repetitive, say what you mean all the time.
Yeah, and news media don't like to do explainers. They would say, well, that's not our job. But actually, if I'm confused about a side effect and I go to YouTube to Google, is this a thing? if you try it, look who you see. But you don't see the New York Times or Washington Post or CNN or Fox. You don't see those news outlets there. And really, they should be playing a role in filling those gaps.
They don't think it's their role. Okay, so going back into specific communities that are sharing vaccine misinformation. One community I'm intrigued by is the wellness, yoga, holistic new age movement. There's a lot of good that exists in that movement, but they're also sharing vaccine disinformation and frankly QAnon too. Why?
Well, I mean, it's really important that we understand the different communities that are sharing this. On one hand, you've got people who you describe as much more kind of on the right wing, very concerned about liberty and freedom. But you're absolutely right. On the other side of the political spectrum, you've got people who you would traditionally think of as to the left. But in many ways, they are very concerned about what they're putting into their own bodies. And they have been, to some extent, deliberately targeted. So QAnon had a deliberate strategy to go after the yoga and wellness communities on Instagram. It was called kind of pastel recruitment, which is, you'd have an Instagram story with like 3 uplifting quotes, and the 4th quote would be about QAnon. But they wouldn't use the term QAnon, but they would talk about child trafficking or some of their other elements as a deliberate recruitment control. And so I think we just have to understand that, again, these communities concerned about their bodies, and unless we really explain what's in vaccines, how they're safe, what ultimately they do to the community, in that if we all get vaccinated, we are safer. I think we've just failed to think about the ways that we, the medical community, or how are we thinking about narratives? Sorry, how are we talking about vaccines for the greater good? As opposed to how will it affect me or my children or my family? It's like, well, how will this benefit the whole community? So yeah, there's a lot we need to be doing.
The question when I posted that you're coming, I got over and over, is how do we disrupt this? Like, if you have a family member who's anti-vax and very concerned, I know that people in your position advise, don't combat their point of view with other facts, don't repeat it. But how do you have that conversation if you don't address directly what they're saying?
So there's no quick way of doing this, and it's about listening. So why is somebody really concerned about the vaccine? Is it that they're worried about what's in it? I mean, there are rumors around aborted fetus tissue was used in it. Understand what it is that they're concerned about, so that then you can arm yourself with a way to reply to it. But what is it that they're frightened of? And sometimes saying something along the lines of, I get it. Like, it's a scary time. Like, I completely understand. Like, empathy, but to say, do you take any other medications? And most people will say, well, yeah, I take this for that, I take that for whatever. And I'm like, well, let's talk a little bit about the side effects that we know come with that. Like, we all are taking decisions every day based on risk. Should I get in the car to go to the airport? I'm more likely to get hit by the car than die in the plane. But we're really bad at thinking about risk. So when we're talking to each other, it's about empathy, it's about listening and trying to understand what they're frightened of. And sometimes if they really have been sucked into some of these communities, for example, anti-vax, you're like, okay, let's go to the website. And you say, well, look, I mean, they're actually selling quite a lot of supplements here. Like, do you think there's a motive maybe behind them? Do you think they really believe this? Or is there maybe something else to it? And so thinking often about motives with the person, not I'll tell you what they're trying to do, but like, let's explore this together. Like, I like you, I'm trying to find quality information. So then it's not I'm right, you're wrong. It's we've both got reasons to be concerned. Let's see what we can find out about this.
So it sounds like you're saying, don't do outright conflict, refute their facts, ask questions, and ask questions that might plant seeds of doubt that they'll mull on their own and maybe come to their own conclusion later.
Yeah, because research shows that actually our worldviews, if you challenge my worldview, I am much more likely to dig in deeper than to be like, oh, thanks, Jessica, that's so interesting. I think I'm going to change my mind. I'm more likely to be like, who's Jessica? What does she think she knows?
Right.
And I'm going to double down. So you can actually cause more harm by approaching these conversations in a way that's really combative.
It makes sense. And the other piece is it to sort of demystify who's behind this, who benefits, why are they doing it, how are they doing it?
Exactly. So there's somebody called Camille Francois who talks about the ABCs of disinformation: actors, behaviors, content. And too often we focus on the C, the content. Let's debunk the content. But actually we should be like, who's behind this and what are their motives? Is it financial? Is it political? Who are they connected to? Who are they funded by? And once you start to make people think in those ways, it helps them, because ultimately, wherever you sit on the political spectrum, however educated you are, none of us want to feel manipulated. And so when you start to say, there are actors out there deliberately trying to manipulate us and to divide our communities, that's their aim, to sow confusion, discord, and division. Well, nobody wants that. So it's a case of not focusing on the particular claim in the content, but giving the wider context. That's much more effective.
So interesting. I saw on the news the other day, they did a package about there's disinformation traveling. Here's the disinformation. And then they did 2 minutes repeating what it is. And then they had a conversation after debunking it. Is that good practice or bad practice?
So, I mean, the academic literature shows that we have to recognize what the claim is. So, for example, the claim that vaccines cause autism, they do not. This has been debunked widely, but many people have heard that. Well, it's less dangerous to talk about that from scratch, and sometimes letting somebody know what you're trying to debunk can be useful. But too often you have the news media saying, you're not going to believe what we found on Facebook, and they repeat the claim. And if I haven't seen that, I'm like, what? And the way our brains work is that we're not particularly good at making sense of all of this. So if I see two things connect, I'm like, what did they say about vaccines and Bill Gates? What did they say? I go to Google, I put vaccines and Bill Gates in, and of course I get a whole host of conspiracy content. So we do have to be careful about how much amplification we give to some of these rumors that actually haven't really got much oxygen. Because again, many of these bad actors don't have much of an audience. They desperately want CNN to debunk that rumor. Because the debunking, as part of that, you're making people connect different issues or different entities that they wouldn't have done previously. So that's another thing the news media has to learn.
On the other hand, if we're doing something like talking about QAnon and people want to know what are their beliefs so they can see it as it emerges, is it dangerous to openly explain what QAnon conspiracy theories contain so they identify it when it happens? Does that perpetuate the conspiracy theory?
So it's about giving context to this.
Okay.
So unfortunately, the news media like to hype up, they talk about blood sacrifice and, child trafficking, as opposed to this started in 2017. It was very fringe. And in many ways, a lot of the beliefs are based on old anti-Semitic tropes, like the Protocols of Elders of Zion. Like, we don't hear that kind of context. We hear much more like, oh, this is crazy.
Right.
And like, kind of a ridiculing of QAnon, which also doesn't work. The more that people have kind of tried to sideline QAnon and say these people are crazy, is actually not taking seriously the reason that people are right now seeking an explanation. And QAnon is giving people that explanation, and we're dismissing that. Like, who are these kooks? As opposed to, why are they susceptible? A lot of this is about community. Many people will say, like mothers will say, I've lost my sons. It's because he works nights. He's got nobody else to talk to, but QAnon are there giving him that support. And I think, again, focusing on the content, we're missing the context, which is it's a community that people feel part of.
And it's so true right now while people are so alienated with COVID and the economic struggles. Let's talk for a minute about how this has gotten mainstreamed, because today a voting technology company called Smartmatic has just filed a massive lawsuit against Fox News and a number of their hosts and other people for disseminating election disinformation on mainstream media. Is that a new phenomenon? And when did this start happening?
So it's a fascinating turn of events, because over the last 5 years, there's been this focus on the platforms. They're disseminating disinformation. And yes, they have played a role and they need to do more than they're doing right now. But there's been a failure to understand the role of the news media in pushing lies. And in terms of regulation, we have very little regulation about the platforms. But when it comes to broadcasting, there are regulations about what you can broadcast. So I think it's fascinating to see there being a line crossed now with like Dominican voting machines, and now these other people saying, enough is enough. Like, there's a bottom line here that when you've crossed this line, it's affected our bottom line, and we're not going to take it anymore. So what's interesting to me as a Brit who lives in America is the First Amendment is all encompassing, but you guys also love to sue. So I sort of feel like there's something interesting here, which is maybe legal frameworks might do more than regulatory frameworks around content.
Right. If it costs the company a lot of money to be pushing this stuff out, they might change their minds. It is, though, different. I think cable news has different guides on what they can and can't say on air than traditional broadcast. And so maybe, do you think we need new regulations for both broadcast and social media?
Yeah, I mean, I think there has to be an element of responsibility. And so the question in the US right now is that the platforms aren't responsible for what appears on their platforms. I mean, there's complexity around this, but for the most part. But in a news environment where you have editors, there's a kind of a liability there around defamation and what you're saying about people. And I think that has been woolly, particularly as you say on cable news networks, and the idea that a lot of this was opinion. But right. I think now there's this sense of you can't be saying that on the airwaves without any repercussions. So yeah, I think this is a bit of a turning point.
So, but despite what's going on Fox and on mainstream news channels, the bulk of this, I think, travels on social still.
Yeah.
Yes?
Yeah, I mean, it definitely starts on social.
And what kinds of regulations, what could we envision what should we look for our leaders to put in place as a regulation to start protecting us from this spread?
Yeah, so this isn't a sexy answer, but the first thing is we need to understand what's actually happening on these platforms. So what we don't have is actually longitudinal analysis of the drip, 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 drip. So there are concerns that any particular post, we can say, well, it doesn't break policy guidelines. But what does it mean if that's all that somebody looks at 8 hours a day? And so my slight concern is that we don't really know enough in terms of regulation. And I think we could have a knee-jerk reaction. What governments could be doing is demanding that the platforms turn over information, like auditing. If I search for vaccines with all these different keywords across all these different platforms, what would a user see? Right. That should be demanded. And I think
we don't have that. The government can't do it right now.
Well, at the moment they haven't asked. And so what we don't have is a sense of what do you see on your Instagram feed versus what do I see?
Right.
And so that in itself is we can't as researchers say whether or not you're disproportionately impacted. So that is the bottom level that we need before we start, because my worry is we'll have regulation that clamps down on speech. And in 10 years' time, historians will say, well, they had this thing called the internet. It wasn't perfect, but they got so freaked out that they basically shut down all this speech and we lost what's great about the internet. So right. I'm also concerned about that in this moment when we have to be careful, but we shouldn't make stark decisions.
Okay, so I want to ask you some questions from the audience. One is, how can I be a smart consumer? What should I think of before I start sharing content on social?
So the number one thing is emotional skepticism. So rather than is it true or false, but when you see a piece of content, does it make you angry? Does it make you scared? Because most disinformation uses emotions to make you feel that way because you're less likely to be critical. So does something make you want to buy something immediately? Like if you feel like you have a visceral reaction, be aware of that and stop and think before you share. And the second thing is, are you the right person to share this information? What is your expertise here? And sometimes we end up sharing with friends and family because we're like, I've seen this, I want to be helpful. But are you the best person to judge this new information about vaccines? And I think because we're in an era of everybody's voice counts, and of course that's amazing, but there's lots of things that I might be an expert on the use of my Instapot, but am I the best person to talk about epidemiology? No. And I think we should be a little bit more aware of what we're sharing. And that's easier said than done, but that emotional skepticism is something we should be teaching everybody because that's how we're targeted. It's the use of making us angry or scared.
I always say they compete for your anxiety, all these outlets. When you feel that triggered, be alert, think twice before sharing, really smart. Is there different advice if you're talking to, somebody said, I teach high school, how do I talk to my students about disinformation? And somebody said, how do I talk to my parents about disinformation? Is it the same across ages?
This is so great because I hear people saying, I'm so scared of the kids. I'm like, I'm not scared of the kids. If they want to put something on Instagram that hasn't been manipulated, they say #NoFilter. Like younger people are actually more aware of content manipulation. They're not as good at understanding motives. They're not as good at understanding how they're being manipulated. So if you're teaching younger people, they've got more of that to learn. My mum, who has grown up in an age of gatekeepers, she assumes that everything on her fancy phone must be true. So what research has shown that in America, the biggest group of people who share misinformation is men over 65. And so actually, dad or granddad is the person who needs to be sat down and to be given some of these lessons because they've grown up with a small number of news outlets. The internet is this magical thing. Everything looks professional. So how can anybody be lying? So they require a different set of training from younger people who assume everything looks professional. They understand Photoshop. So it's slightly different and we need to be doing different things for different ages.
So interesting. Do you think we'll ever be able to get a handle on disinformation as long as these social media platforms exist?
I think that I've got hope. I couldn't get up every day doing this work if I didn't, but I do think it's going to take us 30 years. I mean, this is such a shift to bring the internet to the world. You know, the platforms are doing more than they've done over the last 5 years. So we will continue to see their changes. We will see more government regulation. We'll see better education, because there's no silver bullet here. There's multiple ways we need to respond to all of this. And it's going to take, and the community needs to be part of it. So now everybody's like, what's the government going to do? What platforms going to do? We need to make sure that the community has these conversations. What kind of speech do we want on the internet? Do we want lots of conspiracy theories? How are we going to balance freedom of expression and harm? And so it's not going to be quick, and it's going to take patience, but we will get through it. But we as humans have got to transition into an age where we didn't have much information to now we have an abundance, but with the abundance, and there's abundance of greatness and abundance of rubbish.
You are a wealth of information. Thank you. I feel better knowing that you're on this job. So can you tell us where people can find First Draft? Can they read about how to inoculate themselves and others? What resources would you refer folks to?
Yeah, so we're at firstdraftnews.org, and we're on all the social platforms. I mean, we're currently trying to create more resources for the public. We've previously worked with newsrooms, but now there's a huge need. Everybody keeps emailing us, being like, we need this. So we have an SMS course, which is a 14-day SMS course that you can do every day, whatever time of day, it pings you a little nugget, which is something that we're really proud of. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that might be something that we'll post about on Instagram tonight. So if people want to follow us.
Well, if you put that up, we'll repost it so people can find that. That's great. Claire, thank you for your time. I'd love to continue this discussion. Appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Okay, take good care.